Good morning. Welcome to Chapter 9 of the Limited X-ray Machine Operator course, Scatter Radiation and its Control. This is how we're going to talk about on this particular chapter on how we limit the amount of scatter radiation and by controlling it through different mechanisms. So let's talk about it. Chapter 9. All right, so in this particular PowerPoint, we're going to discuss these learning objectives. List and explain two types of interactions between radiation and matter that produce scatter radiation. Also, we're going to talk about problems caused by the scatter radiation. We're also going to list factors that affect the quantity of scatter radiation and fog on a radiograph. And we're going to identify the scatter radiation fog on a radiograph. We're going to list 4 measures that can be taken to reduce the quantity of scatter, and we're also going to list common grid ratios and state the appropriate application of each and how that helps us in order to reduce the scatter radiation. We're going to define what's meant by grid cutoff, and we're explaining the difference between Bucky and stationary grids, and we're going to state the criteria for determining whether grid use is appropriate. All right, so scatter radiation. Well, bottom line is that when X-rays completely penetrate the body, there is no interaction with matter and no scatter or scattered radiation is formed as a result. However, when X-rays are absorbed in the body, their energy is scattered or converted into new scatter X-rays. This is what we call the Compton effect. The Compton effect occurs at energy levels throughout the diagnostic range of 400 and 125 kVp. Compton scatter travels in all directions. The photoelectric effect is similar to that which forms the characteristic radiation in the X-ray tube itself and uniquely interacts with the body mass rather than an electron interacting with the anode. Right, so the effects of scatter X-ray on images that creates increased density, we call this fog, decreased contrast resulting in more gray shades, and it reduces the visibility of the detail, as noted here in both of these radiographs. All right, so as a limited operator, you will experience specific factors affecting the quantity of the amount of that scatter radiation or the creation of that fog we just spoke of. The amount of scatter radiation increases with increases in the following: tissue volume or thickness, tissue density, which is its atomic number, kilovoltage used, and wider collimation field size. So what can you do about it? You can directly control these factors by limiting the X-ray field size to the area of interest. Also, you can use an appropriate kilovoltage for the amount of tissue and for the area that you're doing your exposure in, and also using what we call a grid. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. All right, so grids. A grid is a device that's placed under the table between the patient and the image receptor, IR. Let's take a look at here. I'm going to minimize myself here real quick. All right, so here we go. This is your grid. As you can see here, this is your image receptor, whether it's a table, whether it's an upright, or whether it's a cassette. The grid is mounted with the inside of the table or with inside of the cassette holder. Okay, as you can see here, this is your primary radiation. This is your tube. This is your collimator. Primary radiation is coming through the patient. Scatter radiation is created, and it's absorbed. The most of it is absorbed within the grid. Okay, everybody understand that? Very good. Specifically, the grid is placed between the patient and the IR to absorb the scatter radiation. It is composed, or the grids are composed, of alternating strips of lead, okay, and radiolucent interspaced material, and may be a moving or stationary grid. This is figure 9-5 on page 111. All right, so grid frequency refers to the distance between the lead strips, okay, the distance between the lead strips in any given grid. The frequencies range between 60 and 196 lead lines per inch, and the radius refers to the alignment or the focusing of the lead strips themselves to the diverging primary X-ray beam. Grids for general purposes are called focus grids because the lead strips are aligned in the direction of the diverging primary X-ray beam. The lead strips of a focus grid are very precisely aligned within the X-ray beam at a specific source image receptor distance. Remember, going back to SID again. So it's specifically aligned for that source image receptor distance, which is called the grid radius. All right, so grid ratio, it refers to the ratio of the height of the lead strips to the distance between them. Absorption of scatter radiation increases as grid ratio increases. You can see this figure and explanation on figure 9-8 on page 112. All right, when do we use grids? Very simply, when the body part itself that you're going to expose is greater than 10 to 12 centimeters, and or when KVP goes up over 60. So grids simply are used to reduce the scatter radiation fog. All right, so grid cutoff. Grid cutoff is when excessive absorption of useful radiation occurs. It also is when misaligned grids result in a visible grid lines or decreased density caused by the absorption of the primary beam. If you can see this particular X-ray, zoom in a little bit closer, you can see that there are grid lines. You can see them from here looking at it. Okay, these are grid lines. Okay. All right, so specialty grid, a grid with strips that are parallel to each other rather than a focused are called a parallel grid. Parallel grids can be very useful for radiography at very long source distant image receptor distance, or SIDs, because the useful portion of the X-ray beam is nearly perpendicular to the grid when the distance is great. Another type of grid is very simply utilizing the crosshatched, crosshatched grids. They're also called a crossed grid. There are actually two grids with the lead strips at right angles to each other. These grids are desirable, not described, but they are described as parallel or crosshatched grids. They're desirable due to the fact that they have an effective ratio that is greater than the ratios of the two grids combined. All right, so in summary on this particular lecture, we talked about scatter radiation, folks. You've got to be able to reduce this stuff. Scatter radiation is going to create you a lot of pain in the butts because you get such foggy images, your practitioner is not going to like them. So it refers to the X-rays that expose the IR but do not contribute to the image formation. Scatter radiation is produced when X-rays undergo, remember, the Compton or photoelectric interaction with matter. Okay, know this definition. You will see that on a test. Okay, so increased density from scatter radiation results in lower contrast and loss of resolution. The effects of scatter radiation, okay, they can be controlled by limiting the X-ray field size to the area of interest, using appropriate kilovoltage, and also using grids. And grids are manufactured with different ratios. Finally, as grid ratios increases, the absorption of scatter radiation increases as well. So the better the ratio, the more absorption you're going to get. Misalignment of the grid may result in visible grid lines and a loss of density or grid cutoff. And general purpose grids are typically focused to the SID. Specialty grids include parallel and crosshatch. Do remember those. You will probably see those on a test as well. All right, once again, I want to thank you for taking part in this lecture. Okay. If you have any questions, be sure to email us at student@emets.net if you're an EMET student, or if you're an EMETCI Institute student, student@emetsciinstitute.com. Don't. Look at the size of that. Okay, Homer's pretty bad off. Okay, and look at that little tiny spinal cord that comes off of it. Oh boy, what a pea brain. Anyhow, thank you very much for participating in this lecture. We will see you next time. Email us if you have questions. Thanks a lot. Have a good night.